My name is Hope Barnes, and I am 26 years old. My parents walked out of my MBA graduation exactly 3 minutes before my name was called, all so they would not be late for my sister's flute recital. But it was the $50 bill I left on the table at dinner that night that ended up costing them their entire home. Before I tell you how that single piece of paper dismantled my family's golden child illusion, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Intimately Told Stories, but only if you genuinely enjoy a satisfying reckoning. Drop a comment letting me know your age and where you are listening from right now. I love connecting with you all. Now let me take you back to the humid May afternoon where my silence finally broke. The air inside the stadium hung thick and heavy. I sat in row 14, drowning in a black gown, listening to the dean announce names. Alvarez, Anderson, Baker. My last name is Barnes. I was so close. I could feel the stiff paper of the program digging into my palms. To my left, my mother Joanne shifted in her seat. The metal hinge squeaked. She raised her wrist, tapping the glass face of her Cartier watch with a manicured fingernail. She leaned toward my father, David. "We have to go," she whispered frantically. "Melody needs to tune before the overture." I sat frozen. I was about to receive a master's degree in logistics, and I was holding my breath like a scolded child. I leaned in, keeping my voice low. "I am 5 names away." David did not look at me. He was already adjusting the lapels of his linen suit. "Hope, be reasonable," he muttered, standing up and blocking the view of the family behind us. "Your sister is the lead flutist. They lock the auditorium doors at 6. We cannot be barred from entry." The rustle of their expensive coats drowned out the announcer calling Bannister. They squeezed past the knees of other proud parents. Joanne left behind the small white corsage she was supposed to pin on my lapel. It sat there, a wilted ghost, resting on the warm plastic of the empty folding chair. Barkley. I watched their backs recede up the concrete steps. Neither turned around for a final wave. The exit doors swung open, letting in a blinding slice of sunlight, and then swallowed them whole. "Barnes, Hope." The applause was generic. I walked across the wooden stage, my heels clicking against the boards, feeling a strange, hollow ringing in my ears. I accepted a leather-bound folder and looked out into the sea of faces. My eyes scanned the crowd instantly, finding the exact spot where 2 empty chairs formed a gap like a missing tooth in a smile. The drive back to Atlanta took 70 minutes. I did not turn on the radio. With every passing mile marker, a heavy realization settled into my chest. For 22 years, I had swallowed my voice. I had played the background character while my sister soaked up the spotlight. When I secured a full-ride scholarship, my father called it practical but blue-collar. I had accepted the scraps of their attention, convincing myself that being self-sufficient meant I did not need their applause. But as the Atlanta skyline pierced the horizon, the pain morphed into a cold, clinical calculus. My mind shifted into the logistical mode I used to fix broken supply chains. Tonight, we were supposed to have a celebratory dinner at an upscale steakhouse. I knew exactly how they would steer the conversation away from my degree and back toward Melody. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling the rough texture of the leather beneath my fingers. For my entire life, I had kept the peace. But the girl who smiled politely while her parents walked out on her greatest achievement died somewhere on that highway. The era of my silence was over. The mahogany doors of the upscale Atlanta steakhouse felt remarkably heavy as I pushed them open. The air inside hit me instantly, thick with the rich scent of charred, dry-aged ribeye, expensive bourbon, and the subtle perfume of wealth. Soft jazz hummed beneath the low murmur of affluent patrons securing deals and celebrating milestones. I stood in the foyer clutching the leather-bound folder that held my diploma. My fingers traced the gold foil emblem of the university. This was supposed to be my celebration, a reservation made weeks in advance to honor the culmination of years of grueling late-night study sessions, supply chain internships, and relentless hard work. I handed my name to the hostess. She offered a polite smile and guided me through the maze of white tablecloths and dim, ambient lighting. I spotted them in a tufted leather booth near the back. 4 people. They had not waited for me. A waiter in a crisp white apron was already pouring golden liquid into tall crystal flutes. Melody sat at the center, holding court. She wore a silk emerald dress that caught the restaurant lighting perfectly, highlighting her practiced, camera-ready smile. Next to her was a man I had only heard about in passing, Carter. He was new to the family dynamic, though his type was painfully familiar to anyone who worked in the corporate side of the entertainment industry. He wore a velvet blazer that possessed an unnatural sheen, a watch that sat too bulky on his wrist, and a smile that reached nowhere near his eyes. He sold himself as a visionary music producer, a man of profound artistic influence. My parents, Joanne and David, leaned in toward him across the table. They looked captivated by whatever grand story Carter was spinning. I slid into the empty chair at the outer edge of the booth. My graduation folder sat on my lap, its sharp corners digging into my thighs. "Oh, you made it," Joanne said, barely glancing away from her new son-in-law-to-be. We went ahead and ordered the appetizers. The recital ran long, and everyone was simply starving. Not a single mention of the ceremony, not a single congratulations, not even a cursory glance at the folder resting on my lap. The waiter appeared like a shadow and offered me a champagne flute. I covered the rim of the glass with my hand and asked for tap water. "Melody was a revelation tonight," David announced, cutting his steak with precise, practiced strokes. The entire auditorium was mesmerized. "You really missed a spectacular performance, Hope." I stared at the ice cubes floating in my water glass. They walked out on my master's degree, an achievement that secured my position managing logistics for major film productions across Georgia, and now I was being reprimanded for missing a local theater recital. In their eyes, my practical success meant nothing compared to Melody's artistic pursuits. To David and Joanne, art equated to high society status. Logistics was just blue-collar labor dressed up in a corporate suit. "And with Carter's industry connections," Joanne added, placing a hand delicately over her heart, "our girl is finally going to get the global recognition she deserves. A European conservatory tour." Carter leaned back against the leather booth, flashing teeth that were a shade too white. "It takes serious capital to make true art happen," he said smoothly, his voice dripping with unearned confidence. "But the return on investment is undeniable. We are talking high-tier venues in Vienna, Paris, and Milan. The exposure alone is priceless." David raised his bourbon glass, his eyes gleaming with the desperate ambition of a man trying to buy his way into a higher social bracket. "That is exactly why we are leveraging equity for the future. You have to invest in true talent to reap the rewards." Leveraging equity. The phrase pinged around my brain like a warning siren. In the logistics and supply chain sector, you learn to spot financial red flags instantly. People who possessed real wealth did not talk about leveraging equity over a steak dinner to a man wearing a faux velvet jacket. They did not speak in vague terms about return on investment without asking to see a balance sheet. But David was so blinded by the allure of patronizing the arts that he was eager to play the wealthy benefactor. "All right," David said, lifting his glass higher, commanding the attention of the entire booth. He looked directly at me. "Hope, raise your glass. To your sister, to Melody and Carter, and a future of beautiful music." The clinking of silverware at the surrounding tables seemed to fade into a dull roar. I looked at the three of them. Melody wore a smug, entitled smile, waiting for her expected tribute. Carter looked entirely bored, checking his phone under the table. Joanne was already raising her flute, her eyes sparkling with manufactured joy. David stared at me, his expression hardening, waiting for my usual obedience. For 22 years, this was the exact moment I would cave. I would force a smile, lift my glass, and drink to my own erasure. I would swallow the bile rising in my throat, push down the hurt of being invisible, and pretend the family picture was perfect. I would play the role of the quiet, supportive background character while the golden child took her bow. I kept my hands resting flat on the heavy white tablecloth. "No." The word hung in the air, sharp and distinct. It was a small word, but it carried the weight of 2 decades of neglect. Joanne lowered her glass, her perfectly drawn eyebrows furrowing in confusion. "Excuse me?" I said no, I repeated, my voice remarkably steady. The cool, clinical calculus from the highway had hardened into something solid and unbreakable behind my ribs. "I will not raise a glass to her." David's jaw clenched tight. The redness started at his collar and began creeping up his neck. "You will not ruin this evening with a jealous mood. Your sister achieved something remarkable today." "I achieved something remarkable today," I said, leaning forward just a fraction, keeping my voice level and calm. "I earned a master's degree. I secured a career that will pay for my own life, and you both walked out of the stadium 3 minutes before they called my name so you could go sit in a high school auditorium." Melody let out a dramatic, exasperated sigh, rolling her eyes toward the ceiling. "Oh, here we go. Everything always has to be about hope. You just cannot stand it when someone else shines." I turned my gaze directly to my sister. "You play the flute in a community orchestra, Melody. You are 24 years old, living rent-free in our parents' guest room, and now you have brought a man to dinner who talks about European tours but wears a blazer he bought off the rack at a discount outlet." Carter bristled, his fake smile dropping instantly, revealing the angry, defensive fraud underneath. "Listen here." "No, you listen," David interrupted, his voice rising, drawing the curious glances of the adjacent tables. His face was now a deep mottled purple. "You will not speak to your sister or her fiancé with such profound disrespect. We left the ceremony because Melody's schedule was fixed. We provided you with an education. We owe you nothing. You will apologize to Melody right now, or you can leave this table." He thought it was a threat. He thought the idea of being exiled from this toxic inner circle would terrify me into submission. He expected the quiet, accommodating daughter to shrink back into her assigned corner, terrified of losing her family's conditional love. I looked at the water glass I had not taken a single sip from. I looked at the three of them, bound together by mutual delusion and a desperate, pathetic need for social status. I felt no anger anymore. I did not feel the sting of rejection. I just felt a vast, echoing clarity. I reached into my purse and pulled out a crisp $50 bill. I placed it gently on the white linen tablecloth, pressing it flat right next to my empty porcelain plate. "That is for the tap water," I said. I stood up, smoothing the front of my dress. I picked up my diploma folder and looked my father dead in the eye. "You are right, David. You owe me nothing. And starting tonight, I owe you exactly the same." I did not wait for his response. I did not look back to see Melody's shocked expression or Joanne's performative gasp. I turned on my heel and walked toward the exit. The heavy mahogany doors pushed open easily, and the warm Atlanta night air hit my face like a promise. I walked to my car with my spine straight, leaving the fractured remains of my family sitting in stunned silence behind me. 72 hours. That was the exact lifespan of my family's outrage. I spent those 3 days buried in supply chain manifests and freight schedules for a sprawling action movie shooting in the North Georgia mountains. My office, sitting on the 3rd floor of a prominent Atlanta film studio, served as a sanctuary of pure logic. In my world, every problem possessed a measurable solution. A delayed lighting shipment meant rerouting transport trucks. A vendor dispute meant auditing the service contracts. Everything operated on facts, data, and accountability. It was a stark contrast to the delusion that fueled my parents' household. I was in the middle of cross-referencing a catering budget when my cell phone vibrated across the sleek glass surface of my desk. The screen lit up, displaying a familiar name, Joanne. I stared at the glowing letters, watching the device inch across the glass with each vibration. A part of me expected a voicemail filled with tearful apologies. Another part expected a harsh reprimand for walking out of the steakhouse. But the analytical side of my brain, the side that negotiated high-stakes corporate deals, knew better. People who leverage guilt do not apologize. They double down. I picked up the device and pressed the green button, bringing the speaker to my ear. "Hope, darling," Joanne said. Her voice floated through the receiver, breezy and light, entirely devoid of tension. It was the exact tone she used when asking a retail clerk to check the back room for a different shoe size. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, listening to the faint static on the line. She did not mention the graduation. She did not mention the steakhouse. She did not acknowledge the $50 bill or the fractured state of our relationship. "Are you busy?" she continued, not waiting for an answer. "Because we have some incredibly exciting news, and we wanted you to be the first to know. Carter just finalized the logistics for Melody's European Conservatory tour." I kept my eyes fixed on the glowing spreadsheet on my computer monitor. "That is fast," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. 3 days ago, it was just an idea over dinner." "Well, Carter is a mover and a shaker," Joanne chirped, her enthusiasm grating against my nerves. "He has connections everywhere. Paris, Vienna, Milan. The venues are practically begging for a talent like Melody. It is the opportunity of a lifetime. The only small hiccup is the upfront capital." There it was, the pivot, the true reason for the phone call. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. The cold truth washed over me, stripping away any remaining naive hope I held for my family. They did not call to mend fences. They called because they needed funding. International tours require a substantial deposit to secure the concert halls, Joanne explained, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper as if we were plotting a grand adventure together. David and I are tying up our liquid assets in a new venture right now, so our cash flow is temporarily restricted. But Carter found a brilliant private lender who specializes in arts funding. We just need a qualified co-signer to guarantee the advance. A co-signer? How much is the advance? I asked. It is just a formality, really, she said, waving off the concern with her tone. $50,000. But Carter guarantees the ticket sales will cover the principal within the first 3 weeks of the tour. Your name would only be on the paperwork for a month at most. $50,000. I let the number hang in the air, bridging the distance between my corporate office and her suburban living room. My mind raced, piecing together the grim reality of my position in this family. For 22 years, I believed I was the ignored daughter because I lacked Melody's stage presence. I thought my practical nature bored them, but the truth was far more insidious. I was not just the ignored daughter, I was the contingency plan. They viewed Melody as a delicate porcelain doll meant to be showcased and admired. They viewed me as a human automated teller machine. My master's degree, my grueling hours, my steady climb up the corporate ladder, none of it earned their respect. It only earned their predatory interest. They wanted to harvest my financial stability to fund the golden child's fantasy. The sheer audacious entitlement radiated through the phone. Joanne sat in her pristine house expecting me to risk my credit score, my savings, and my future for a man who wore faux velvet and spun lies over expensive steak. If I refused outright, the narrative would write itself. Joanne would immediately hang up and tell the extended family that I was a bitter, jealous sister hoarding my wealth while trying to crush Melody's dreams. The screaming match would commence, and I would be cast as the villain. I took a slow, deep breath, inhaling the faint scent of the studio's ozone and fresh coffee. I closed the spreadsheet on my monitor and opened a blank document. The wounded daughter seeking her parents' validation evaporated. The corporate strategist took the wheel. That is a significant amount of money, I said, injecting a note of hesitant curiosity into my voice. I deployed the red herring, tossing it directly into the churning waters of her ambition. If I am going to put my signature on a binding financial instrument, I need to do my due diligence. You understand, right? Oh, of course, Joanne replied, her tone instantly brightening, recognizing what she perceived as compliance. David said you would want to dot the I's and cross the T's. You always were such a stickler for paperwork. Tell Carter to send me his investment portfolio, I instructed, my voice cool and professional. I need the business licenses for his production company, the venue contracts for the European tour, and the prospectus he showed the private lender. If the numbers align the way you say they do, we can discuss the signature. Joanne let out a delighted little laugh. The sound turned my stomach. It was the sound of a predator thinking the trap had successfully snapped shut on the prey. I knew you would come through for your sister, she cooed. Family helps family, Hope. It is what we do. I will have Carter email you the entire packet right away. He is so organized, you are going to be so impressed. I will wait for his email, I said, and pressed the button to end the call. I placed the phone face down on the glass desk. The silence in my office felt different now. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of being ignored. It was the sharp, focused silence of a hunter zeroing in on a target. Carter believed he could stroll into my family, flatter my parents, and use my hard-earned credibility to line his own pockets. Joanne and David believed they could abandon me at my graduation and then command me to finance their delusions 3 days later. They all thought I was a naive workaholic who would blindly sign away $50,000 just to earn a crumb of their approval. They were entirely oblivious to the reality of who I was. Managing supply chains for global film studios required an obsessive attention to detail. I tracked millions of dollars across international borders. I vetted vendors, audited corporate backgrounds, and unraveled financial discrepancies for a living. Carter was about to hand a professional logistics executive the exact rope needed to dismantle his entire facade. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the sprawling studio lot. Golf carts zipped between massive sound stages. Grip trucks unloaded heavy equipment. It was an empire built on precision and truth. I crossed my arms over my chest, feeling a profound internal shift anchor itself in my bones. I was no longer playing the dutiful, beaten-down daughter. I was preparing for war. And when Carter sent that portfolio, I was going to tear their golden illusion to shreds. The phone on my desk vibrated with a sharp, angry buzz, rattling my favorite titanium pen against the sleek glass surface. Then it vibrated again, and again. An avalanche of notifications flooded the lock screen, illuminating the dim corners of my office. I did not need to unlock the device to know what was happening. Joanne had mobilized her troops. When you grow up in a toxic family system, you learn to recognize the battle tactics early. Joanne did not just ask for a $50,000 co-signature. She preemptively weaponized the extended relatives to ensure compliance. She knew that if I hesitated, the pressure of collective family shaming would typically force me to cave. I leaned forward, reading the snippets of text flashing across the screen. From Aunt Susan. Your mother is in tears. How can you hold Melody's dreams hostage over a petty grudge? From Uncle Ben. We always knew you struggled with sharing the spotlight, but sabotaging your sister's European tour is a new low. Fix this. From my cousin Sarah. Wow, Hope. Way to ruin the engagement glow. You really need therapy. The psychological warfare was swift and calculated. Joanne had spun a masterpiece of a narrative. In her version of events, I was the wealthy, bitter corporate spinster, attempting to crush the radiant artist out of sheer spite. The entire family bought it instantly because it fit the roles we had been assigned since childhood. Melody was the prodigy destined for greatness. I was the ungrateful workaholic who never smiled enough in family photos. A familiar tightening gripped my chest. The old Hope would have drafted a dozen frantic apologies. She would have called Aunt Susan to explain her side only to be talked over and dismissed. She would have signed the loan just to make the sickening buzzing stop. I picked up the phone, swiped down on the control center, and tapped the crescent moon icon. Do not disturb. The screen went dark, the buzzing ceased, the silence that followed was pristine. I turned my attention back to the dual monitors on my desk. An email had just arrived in my corporate inbox. The sender name read Carter Sterling. The subject line was titled, Global Symphony Ventures LLC Investment Portfolio. Carter had taken the bait. I clicked open the email. The message body was brief, dripping with unearned arrogance. He wrote that he hoped a simple logistics worker could comprehend high-level entertainment finance. He attached 3 PDF documents. I downloaded them, dragging the files onto my secondary monitor. At first glance, the documents looked slick. They featured glossy stock images of grand European concert halls, intricate pie charts detailing projected ticket sales, and a roster of private investors whose names were conveniently redacted for privacy. A layman might have been impressed by the bold fonts and the sheer volume of industry buzzwords packed into the paragraphs. But I was not a layman. I managed the supply chain for a major Georgia film studio. My daily responsibilities included vetting multi-million-dollar vendor contracts, auditing international freight invoices, and uncovering fraudulent shell companies trying to scam the production lot. I spent my life staring at spreadsheets, looking for the single discrepancy that signaled a lie. Carter's portfolio was a house of cards waiting for a strong breeze. I opened my web browser and navigated directly to the Georgia Secretary of State Business Registry. If Global Symphony Ventures LLC was a legitimate powerhouse organizing international tours, their corporate registration would reflect a history of steady growth and proper capitalization. I typed the entity name into the search bar and pressed enter. The results loaded instantly. The LLC was formed exactly 3 weeks ago. The registered business address was not a high-end Music Row office in Midtown Atlanta. It was a rented mailbox at a discount shipping store in a rundown strip mall in Marietta. A cold smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. I minimized the registry and opened my department's enterprise background software. This tool was typically reserved for screening heavy machinery contractors and catering conglomerates before allowing them access to our secured film sets. I plugged in Carter's full legal name and his shiny new LLC. I clicked Run and waited. The loading wheel spun for 10 seconds before the screen populated. The text that filled my monitor was glaringly red. In the world of corporate compliance, red meant liability. Carter's file was a tapestry of financial ruin. He was not a visionary music producer. According to his employment history, he was a freelance location scout. He had spent the last 4 years finding obscure warehouses and rural Georgia farmhouses for low-budget independent films. And he was terrible at it. The system flagged 3 separate breach of contract disputes where he failed to secure the proper municipal filming permits, leaving production crews stranded and hemorrhaging cash. I scrolled down to the financial disclosures, and the sinking feeling in my gut morphed into pure adrenaline. The red text detailed multiple active civil judgments. He had a repossessed luxury vehicle on his record. He had defaulted on 3 separate personal loans. His total outstanding debt hovered in the high 6 figures. The man sitting in the steakhouse wearing a faux velvet blazer lecturing my father about leveraging equity was practically destitute. I opened the 3rd PDF he had sent me. The European Conservatory Tour Prospectus. It listed specific dates for venues in Paris and Vienna. In my line of work, logistics overlapping with event management meant sharing the same global booking databases. I opened a new tab and logged into a proprietary international venue registry we used for overseas film premieres. I checked the dates Carter had listed for the Parisian Concert Hall. The venue was already booked solid for a corporate technology summit during that entire month. There was no reservation for Melody Barnes. There was no hold under Global Symphony Ventures. The European tour was a total fabrication, spun out of thin air to justify demanding $50,000. I sat back in my chair, the leather squeaking softly in the quiet office. The gravity of the situation settled over me. Carter was a serial con artist. He had targeted my family because they were the perfect marks. David and Joanne possessed an insatiable desperation for high society status. They wanted so badly to be the wealthy patrons of the arts that they blinded themselves to the obvious red flags. Carter stroked their egos, promised them global prestige, and in return, he planned to siphon their retirement savings to pay off his mounting legal debts. And they wanted me to finance the theft. I took a sip of my cold coffee, letting the bitter taste sharpen my focus. I had the evidence to destroy his illusion. I could print these reports, drive to the suburbs, and drop them on my father's mahogany desk. But as I moved my mouse to close the background check portal, a specific string of numbers caught my eye. It was the employer identification number attached to Carter's fraudulent LLC. In supply chain management, memorizing vendor codes becomes second nature. You recognize patterns. That specific numerical sequence looked hauntingly familiar. I minimized the background software and opened my department's internal procurement dashboard. This was the system where local businesses submitted bids to provide services for the film studio. I typed Carter's tax identification number into our internal search bar. The system chimed, locating a match. I clicked the highlighted file and stared at the screen, my blood running cold. Carter had not just targeted my family. He was attempting to infiltrate my professional domain. 2 days ago, Global Symphony Ventures had submitted an urgent vendor application to the studio. But he was not offering musical scores or sound production. He had applied for a low-level craft services contract, hoping to secure a bid to provide cheap catering for a zombie movie shooting on Lot 4. The application reeked of desperation. He was begging for a 30-day net payment advance to supply stale bagels and lukewarm coffee to our grip crews. The pieces clicked together with horrifying precision. He needed cash immediately to stave off his creditors. The $50,000 loan from my parents was his primary grift, but he was simultaneously throwing desperate applications at every corporation in Atlanta, trying to secure any scrap of income. He had no idea that the logistics executive tasked with approving or denying his pathetic catering bid was the same woman he had mocked at the steakhouse. I rested my chin on my folded hands, staring at his forged catering licenses on my monitor. The smear campaign orchestrated by my mother was still sitting in my phone, a barrage of toxic messages demanding I submit to their golden son-in-law. They believed I was the villain. They believed Carter was their savior. If I denied his vendor application, he would receive an automated corporate rejection email by the end of the business day. He would know that someone in the studio supply chain department had flagged his fake LLC, and given his arrogant, desperate nature, a cornered con artist never retreats gracefully. They lash out. He was going to realize that I held the keys to both his family grift and his only corporate lifeline. And when a parasite realizes the host has discovered the infection, the parasite strikes first. I watched the digital clock on my computer screen tick forward, preparing for the inevitable collision. The automated vendor rejection email triggered precisely at 5 o'clock the previous evening. I had authorized the system to dispatch the standard notification, denying Global Symphony Ventures their requested catering contract. I knew Carter would receive the alert on his phone within seconds. I also knew a desperate man cornered by his own financial ruin would not simply delete the message and move on. He would recognize my name in the sender field. He would realize the quiet sister from the steakhouse held the keys to his only corporate lifeline. The morning sun baked the Georgia asphalt as I parked my sedan in the executive lot. The sprawling film studio hummed with early activity. Production assistants rushed past holding walkie-talkies. Grip trucks reversed into loading bays. This was my sanctuary. This was the empire I navigated with precision and skill far removed from the toxic delusions of my parents' suburban home. Or so I thought. I grabbed my coffee and walked into the glass-fronted lobby of the logistics building. The receptionist normally greeted me with a bright smile and a rundown of the morning freight schedules. Today, she looked down at her keyboard, her shoulders tense, avoiding my gaze. "Hope," she said, her voice quiet. "Mr. Gaines requested your presence in the upper conference room. He asked that you head up the moment you arrive." Vincent Gaines served as the vice president of studio operations. He was a stern, pragmatic man who valued efficiency above all else. A summons to the upper conference room without a prior calendar invitation signaled a severe disruption. A cold knot tightened beneath my ribs. The sanctuary was breached. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. The steel doors slid shut, reflecting my neutral expression. I smoothed the front of my tailored navy blazer, mentally reviewing every major supply chain contract I had touched over the past month. Everything was balanced. Every invoice was audited. I stepped out onto the plush carpet of the executive suite. The air conditioning on this floor always ran a few degrees colder, creating a crisp, sterile environment designed for high-stakes negotiations. I pushed open the heavy oak door to the conference room. The space smelled of expensive leather and fresh whiteboard markers. Vincent sat at the head of a long mahogany table, his hands folded over a thick manila folder, and sitting in one of the cold leather guest chairs, looking entirely too comfortable, was Carter. He wore a different blazer today. This one was a shiny synthetic gray material masquerading as a designer cut. The fabric pulled awkwardly across his shoulders. His posture radiated a forced, casual confidence. When I walked in, a slow, satisfied smile crept across his face, settling into the corners of his mouth. It was the look of a predator who believed he had successfully cornered his prey. "Have a seat, Hope," Vincent instructed. His tone lacked its usual professional warmth. It was clipped and serious. I pulled out the leather chair opposite Carter and sat down, placing my tablet on the polished wood surface. I did not look at my sister's fiancé. I kept my focus locked on the vice president. "We have a very serious matter to discuss," Vincent began, opening the manila folder. "Studio integrity is the foundation of our production capabilities. If vendors believe our supply chain department operates on a pay-to-play system, we lose our corporate credibility." I kept my hands folded in my lap. "I am afraid I do not understand, Mr. Gaines." Carter leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Let me help clarify," he said, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. "I came here today to protect the studio from predatory practices. It brings me no joy to report family, but business is business." Vincent slid a stack of printed papers across the mahogany table toward me. "This gentleman submitted a vendor application for craft services yesterday. He claims that upon submission you contacted him through a private channel. He alleges you demanded a 20% cash kickback in exchange for approving his catering contract on Lot 4. The sheer audacity of the lie forced a sharp breath into my lungs. Carter was not just trying to secure a catering gig anymore. He was attempting to frame me for corporate extortion. He wanted me fired. He wanted my reputation destroyed. If I was disgraced and terminated, his shell company could swoop in, file a grievance, and potentially extort a settlement, or secure the logistics contract in the ensuing chaos. He also provided documentation, Vincent added, tapping the stack of papers. I reached out and pulled the printed pages closer. The quiet, tense hum of the office air conditioner filled the silence as I examined the sheets. They were printed emails. The sender address displayed my exact corporate email handle. The messages outlined a crude transactional demand for illicit funds. The text used industry jargon, phrases like net 30 terms and vendor authorization codes, attempting to lend authenticity to the forgery. I looked up from the papers. Carter met my gaze. The smugness in his eyes was blinding. He truly believed he held the winning hand. He thought the quiet girl who walked out of the steakhouse was an easy target. He assumed my silence over the past 22 years equated to weakness. "Mr. Gaines," Carter said, turning his attention back to the vice president, putting on a masterful theatrical performance, "I only wanted to provide honest services to your film crews. Melody, my fiancée and Hope's sister, warned me that Hope harbored deep-seated jealousy regarding our upcoming marriage. I never imagined she would weaponize her corporate position to sabotage my livelihood out of spite. It is a tragedy, really. She is willing to jeopardize your studio just to settle a petty family dispute." Vincent steepled his fingers, resting his chin on his hands. He looked gravely at me, weighing the severity of the situation. Embezzlement and kickbacks were federal offenses. The studio fired executives for mere rumors of such actions. "Hope," Vincent said, his voice heavy with disappointment, "these emails clearly originate from your internal account. They detail a specific monetary demand, matching the exact value of the catering bid. I need you to explain these allegations immediately." The room felt like a pressure cooker. The battle lines had shifted from suburban living rooms to corporate boardrooms. Carter brought the toxic family dynamic directly into the one place I built for myself. He wanted to strip away my independence, my income, and my dignity, leaving me just as desperate and ruined as he was. I looked at the printed emails again. My eyes scanned the header information. I noted the timestamps. I traced the routing data printed at the very top of the page. Carter had done his research, but he was a failed location scout playing in a league he did not comprehend. He knew how to copy and paste a corporate logo. He knew how to spoof a sender name. But he knew nothing about the digital architecture of a global logistics firm. Carter shifted in his leather chair, crossing his legs to display a pair of cheap, scuffed loafers. He watched me, expecting tears. He expected me to panic, to stammer, to beg for my job. He expected the same broken girl my parents constantly belittled. I felt my pulse steady. The fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating calm. He brought a forged piece of paper to a digital fortress. I slowly pushed the printed emails back toward the center of the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of fear. I turned my head to face the vice president, locking onto his stern gaze. "Mr. Gaines," I said, my tone matching the crisp chill of the air conditioning, "these emails are fraudulent, and I can prove it right now." Carter let out a short, mocking laugh, shaking his head as if pitying my denial. The smirk on his face deepened. He severely underestimated how a logistics executive documents her life. I slid my index finger across the trackpad of my tablet, waking the high-resolution screen. The device illuminated the polished mahogany table, casting a pale, sterile glow over the forged documents Carter had provided. I did not rush my movements. Panic is the enemy of logic. I opened my remote access application, linking directly to the studio's encrypted enterprise server. Mr. Gaines watched my hands with sharp professional interest, while Carter adjusted his posture, attempting to feign nonchalance. I noticed the slight rigidness in his shoulders and the way his jaw clamped tight. He did not anticipate a technical verification process. He expected a dramatic emotional breakdown, fitting the narrative Joanne had fed him about the weak, compliant sister. I tapped the screen, bringing up our internal mail exchange routing data. I turned the tablet so Vincent could clearly see the interface. "Mr. Gaines," I said, keeping my tone even and measured, "every piece of correspondence generating from our corporate domain carries a unique, encrypted cryptographic signature. This system tracks the exact IP address, the originating terminal, and the timestamp down to the millisecond to prevent industrial espionage." I pointed to the printed papers, sitting between us on the polished wood. "The header on these printouts indicates I sent the extortion demands at 2:15 yesterday afternoon." I tapped a specific row of code on my monitor. This is the global server log for my account during that entire hour. The outgoing message count is 0. Furthermore, the routing prefix on his printout lists a public commercial internet provider, a local coffee shop network to be precise. It did not originate from our secure internal network. Vincent leaned closer, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles to examine the digital logs. The deep lines on his forehead deepened further as the reality of the forgery became undeniable. The evidence was irrefutable. I was not finished dismantling the illusion. I swiped to the next tab, pulling up the background check I had run the previous day. Carter claimed I extorted him to approve his catering contract. But extortion requires a vendor capable of actually fulfilling the service. I tapped the screen again, highlighting the glaring red text. This is the financial profile for Global Symphony Ventures LLC, I explained. It is a shell entity formed less than 30 days ago, and this is the personal financial disclosure for Carter Sterling. Carter lunged forward, reaching his hand across the table toward the tablet. That is private information, he snapped, his voice cracking slightly, losing its smooth theatrical cadence. You have no right to pull my credit history. Vincent placed a firm, heavy hand on the table, stopping the sudden movement. When you submit a bid to supply this studio, you authorize a full financial compliance check, Vincent stated, his voice dropping an octave into a dangerous, icy register. Sit down. Carter sank back into the leather chair. A single bead of sweat formed at his hairline, tracing a slow, agonizing path down his temple. The confident smirk vanished, replaced by the pale, panicked expression of a cornered fraud. The faux designer suit suddenly looked exactly like what it was, cheap fabric clinging to a desperate man. I continued guiding Vincent through the report. He has active civil judgments for breach of contract. He possesses a credit score bordering on insolvency. He has zero capital to purchase catering supplies, let alone service a major motion picture set. He forged these emails because the automated system flagged his application and rejected it yesterday at 5 o'clock. He wanted to frame me to create a scandal, hoping the studio would offer a quick financial settlement to keep things quiet. The quiet hum of the air conditioner felt deafening in the ensuing pause. Vincent Gaines sat back in his chair, letting the silence stretch out. He looked at the printed, forged emails, then looked at the trembling man sitting across from him. The vice president did not yell. Men with real power rarely need to raise their voices. He picked up the desk phone and pressed a single button. Security to the upper conference room, please. Carter scrambled to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the plush carpet. Now listen, Vincent, this is a misunderstanding. She manipulated those computer files. She is trying to ruin me because she is jealous of my relationship with her family. Vincent ignored the frantic plea. He looked at me, giving a curt nod of approval. Your diligence protected the studio today, Hope. We will have the legal department draft a formal cease and desist order before noon. 2 security guards stepped into the room. Their physical presence was swift and undeniable. They flanked Carter, standing tall and imposing in their dark uniforms. Escort Mr. Sterling off the lot, Vincent commanded, pointing toward the heavy oak door. If he, or any entity associated with his name, attempts to access this property again, you are to contact local law enforcement immediately. He is permanently banned from all studio grounds. Carter stammered, his face flushing a furious crimson. He pointed a shaking finger at me as the guards grabbed him by the arms, guiding him toward the exit. You think you won? He hissed, his voice echoing down the executive hallway as they dragged him backward. You just destroyed your own family. You hear me? You are dead to them. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut, silencing his hollow threats. I sat in the conference room, taking a long, slow breath. My career remained fortified. The digital fortress held firm against the invasion. I gathered my tablet, feeling a profound sense of validation wash over me. For the first time, I had stood up to the toxic orbit of my family and walked away unscathed. I had used my intellect and my resources to protect my livelihood. But a parasitic con artist does not simply accept defeat. As I returned to my office and poured a fresh cup of coffee, Carter was already standing on the hot pavement outside the studio gates, dialing his phone. He did not call his non-existent investors. He called his most gullible mark. I would not hear the specific details of that phone call until much later, but the execution was a masterclass in manipulation. Melody answered on the second ring. Carter did not tell her he was escorted out by security for forging documents. He spun a frantic, tragic narrative, painting himself as the innocent victim of a cruel corporate conspiracy. He told her I had abused my executive power to blacklist him from the entire Georgia film industry. He claimed I fabricated financial lies to the studio executives out of pure spite because I could not stand seeing her happy and successful. He told her I ripped a lucrative catering contract right out of his hands, ending his producing career forever. Melody did not demand proof. She did not ask for my side of the story or question the logic of his claims. She ran straight to Joanne and David, weeping hysterically about the cold, jealous sister who had just ruined her future husband. And my parents, consumed by their desperate need to protect the golden child, swallowed the lie whole. Their indignation boiled over, eclipsing any remaining shred of parental logic or financial caution. They decided I needed to be punished. They needed to prove that my corporate success meant nothing compared to their unyielding family loyalty. To compensate for Carter's fictitious lost career and to fund the extravagant engagement party they believed he deserved, they drove straight to their local bank branch. They sat across from a loan officer and signed away the equity on their sprawling suburban home, securing a $150,000 second mortgage. They were about to hand a fortune to a con artist just to spite me, and that impending financial ruin would soon draw me right back into the crosshairs, forcing me to make the hardest decision of my life. 48 hours had passed since studio security marched Carter off the lot. The fallout within my family network was instantaneous and severe. My personal cell phone remained locked in a drawer, muted from the barrage of hostile text messages, but the digital silence spoke volumes. Joanne and David were preparing to formally sever ties. I knew the excommunication was imminent. They would demand back their house keys, erase me from the holiday rosters, and cement my status as the ungrateful outcast. I welcomed the impending exile. It felt like standing on the edge of a vast open frontier. But there was one specific item inside their sprawling suburban fortress I refused to leave behind. I navigated my sedan through the winding, manicured streets of their affluent northern Atlanta subdivision. The neighborhood represented a suffocating pursuit of optical perfection. Every lawn was cut to the exact same millimeter. Every driveway featured imported luxury sedans. It was a community built entirely on the fragile currency of social perception. I pulled up to the familiar brick colonial. The driveway was empty. David was likely at his golf club, networking with men he deemed important, while Joanne was undoubtedly at a spa complaining to her socialite friends about her treacherous eldest daughter. I stepped onto the front porch, the Georgia heat pressing down on my shoulders. I slid my old brass key into the deadbolt. The lock tumbled with a heavy metallic thud. I pushed open the solid oak door and stepped into the foyer. The house greeted me with a stifling, museum-quality silence. The air smelled of lemonwood polish and expensive synthetic floral arrangements. I walked past the grand curved staircase, my heels sinking into the plush white carpet. Family portraits lined the hallway. Melody holding her first flute, Melody at her high school prom, Joanne and David smiling radiantly on a cruise ship. My face did not appear in a single frame. I was a ghost haunting a residence I had lived in for 18 years. I did not linger in the foyer. I climbed the stairs and walked straight into my childhood bedroom. The space had long been converted into a generic guest suite, stripped of my identity, but I knew where to look. I opened the bottom drawer of the vintage vanity and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside rested my grandmother's antique silver watch. It possessed no significant market value, yet it represented the only genuine artifact in a lineage obsessed with manufactured prestige. She was the only relative who valued pragmatism over performance. I fastened the cool metal band around my wrist, feeling a quiet surge of strength. I had what I came for. It was time to leave this house forever. I descended the staircase, my hand trailing along the polished wooden banister. As I reached the ground floor, I turned toward the front door. But a subtle anomaly caught my eye. David's home office sat at the end of the hall. He treated that room like a sacred vault, always keeping the heavy mahogany door shut and locked. Today, the door stood ajar. A sliver of warm afternoon light spilled out into the shadowed corridor. Curiosity, honed by years of corporate auditing, compelled me to walk closer. I nudged the heavy door open. The office smelled of stale cologne and expensive leather binding. The room was a monument to his ego, walls lined with framed commendations and photographs of him shaking hands with local politicians. But the pristine organization of the space was disrupted. The large executive desk, usually cleared of all clutter, was currently covered in a chaotic spread of financial paperwork. I stepped into the room, my logistical instincts flaring to life. In supply chain management, you learn to read the story a document tells before you even process the numbers. The layout of the pages, the red ink, the specific banking letterheads, they all painted a distinct picture of urgent, reckless financial movement. I stood over the desk and looked down at the top document. It was a residential loan application from a prominent regional bank. Stamped across the top right corner, in bold, undeniable red ink, was a single word: approved. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs of legal jargon, cutting straight to the numerical figures. The principal loan amount read $150,000. I traced the line down to the collateral section. David and Joanne had pledged the deed to this exact house. They had taken out a massive second mortgage, liquidating the equity they had spent 3 decades building. The phrase my father used at the steakhouse echoed in the quiet room: leveraging equity for the future. He was not boasting about a brilliant stock portfolio. He was signaling his intention to bet the family farm. I sifted through the stack, my fingers brushing against bank transfer authorizations and routing receipts. The destination for the $150,000 was not a secure mutual fund or a legitimate booking agency. The wire transfer receipt confirmed the cash had already cleared. The receiving account belonged to Global Symphony Ventures, LLC, Carter's fraudulent shell company. I let out a slow, ragged breath, the sheer magnitude of the disaster washing over me. The puzzle pieces locked together with horrifying clarity. Carter had spun his web of lies following his humiliating ejection from the film studio. He told them I destroyed his career. He played the martyred artist. And David, blinded by his desperate need to fund a European tour that did not exist, handed the con artist a fortune in liquid cash. But there was another document sitting underneath the wire transfer. It was a glossy brochure for an elite, historic country club located in Savannah, Georgia. Clipped to the brochure was a printed email from Joanne to the club's event coordinator. The text outlined plans for a lavish, high society engagement party for Melody and Carter, boasting a guest list of 200 influential figures. They were not just funding a fake tour, they were financing an extravagant social coronation. Carter had successfully drained their retirement to throw a party honoring his own grift. My hand instinctively hovered over the smartphone in my pocket. The biological urge to protect my family surged upward, battling against every logical boundary I had constructed. I could dial David's number right now. I could demand he call the bank to freeze the wire transfer. I could lay out the evidence of Carter's civil judgments, his fake catering bids, and his imminent bankruptcy. I could save them from losing the very roof over their heads. My fingers touched the smooth glass screen of my device. Then I stopped. I looked at the framed photos on the mahogany walls. I saw David smiling next to a local judge, projecting an image of total authority and untouchable intellect. I remembered the cold, dismissive tone he used when he ordered me to apologize to the con artist at the steakhouse. I remembered Joanne checking her Cartier watch, abandoning my graduation ceremony because celebrating my real achievements bored her. I remembered the barrage of toxic text messages, the smear campaign designed to isolate and break me. If I called them, they would not thank me. They would not view me as their savior. They would accuse me of snooping, of fabricating the evidence, of trying to sabotage Melody's happiness out of sheer, unadulterated spite. They would double down on their delusion because admitting they were conned meant admitting their golden child was engaged to a parasite. You cannot save people who are entirely committed to their own destruction. I pulled my hand away from my phone. The quiet daughter who constantly sought their approval dissolved into the shadows of that mahogany office. I neatly aligned the stack of banking papers, leaving them exactly as I had found them. I turned my back on the desk, walked out of the office, and pulled the heavy door shut until the latch clicked. I walked out the front entrance, locking the deadbolt behind me. The humid Georgia air felt different now. It felt lighter. The gravitational pull of their toxic orbit was broken. They had chosen their path, and I was finally walking mine. I climbed into my sedan, started the engine, and merged onto the highway, heading back toward the Atlanta skyline. The antique watch on my wrist ticked a steady, comforting rhythm. The impending financial ruin of David and Joanne was no longer my burden to carry. But as I navigated the heavy afternoon traffic, the dashboard interface illuminated. My corporate phone chimed through the car speakers, overriding the silence. It was a high-priority alert from the studio's executive legal department. The notification subject line flashed across the digital screen, seizing my attention instantly. Urgent. Vendor guarantee contract flagged for fraudulent signature. The cold, clinical detachment I had just achieved shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Carter had not just stolen my parents' equity. The desperate con artist, realizing the stolen cash was not enough to secure the elite Savannah venue, had crossed a dangerous criminal threshold. He had dragged my corporate empire directly into the blast radius, and the legal war he just initiated was going to end with a public execution. 2 weeks drifted by in a deceptive, quiet haze. I threw myself into the rhythm of my logistics empire, letting the predictable flow of supply chains wash away the lingering sting of my suburban discoveries. My days consisted of negotiating freight rates, auditing international shipping manifests, and managing the relentless pace of Georgia's film industry. The predictable, rigid structure of my corporate life served as the perfect antidote to the chaotic delusions of my parents. They did not call. I did not reach out. I operated under the assumption that they were busy orchestrating their grand societal debut, burning through their newly acquired second mortgage to fund Carter's illusions. I believed the barrier I erected between us was secure. I was wrong. Toxic entitlement does not respect boundaries. It merely looks for a new way to break in. The breach occurred on a Tuesday afternoon. I sat at my glass desk reviewing a quarterly budget projection when a high-priority alert hijacked my computer screen. The notification did not originate from my standard supply chain dashboard. It came directly from the studio's executive legal department. The subject line flashed in bold, urgent lettering, indicating a vendor guarantee contract flagged for a fraudulent signature. My pulse stuttered. A sudden sharp spike of adrenaline flooded my veins, making my fingertips go cold. In the corporate logistics sector, a flagged financial guarantee is not a minor administrative error. It signifies a severe liability, a potential breach that could cost a company its operational licenses. I picked up my desk phone before it could even complete its first ring. Jonathan Reed, the studio's senior corporate counsel, spoke the moment the line connected. "Hope, I need you down in legal right now." I did not ask questions. I locked my workstation, walked out of my office, and took the elevator down to the second floor. The legal department operated in a secure, climate-controlled wing of the building, smelling faintly of rich espresso and freshly printed parchment. It was a space designed for crisis management and risk mitigation. I pushed open the heavy glass door to Jonathan's office. He stood behind his broad desk, his brow deeply furrowed, staring at a digital document displayed on a large wall monitor. He gestured for me to take a seat, but I remained standing, my eyes locking onto the glowing screen. "We caught this during a routine vendor credit sweep," Jonathan explained, his voice tight with professional concern. "A luxury venue down on the coast ran a commercial credit check against our logistics subsidiary this morning. They were verifying a financial guarantor application submitted under your name." He tapped a few keys on his keyboard, magnifying the document on the screen. I stared at the digitized paperwork. The letterhead belonged to an elite, historic country club located in Savannah, Georgia. It was a vendor financing contract, a specialized credit instrument used to secure high-end event spaces without requiring immediate liquid capital. The document outlined the terms for a lavish engagement gala featuring a hosted bar, premium catering, and imported floral arrangements. My eyes darted to the liability section. The total cost of the venue advance was a staggering $80,000. And right there, at the bottom of the final page, resting on the designated guarantor line, was my name. Or rather, a crude digital approximation of my signature, authorized alongside my exact corporate identification number. The air in the office felt suddenly thin. A cold, heavy realization settled into my stomach. The stakes had just elevated far beyond petty family drama or suburban financial ruin. We had crossed a dangerous, irrevocable threshold into federal criminal liability. Carter did not just use David and Joanne's cash. The $150,000 my parents extracted from their home equity was clearly not enough to satisfy the con artist. Perhaps he used their cash to pay off his most aggressive creditors, or maybe he funneled it into hidden offshore accounts to secure his own escape route. Whatever he did with their money, it left him short on funds to actually pay for the extravagant Savannah party he promised them. So he needed credit, and since his own financial profile was a wasteland of civil judgments and repossessions, he needed a pristine corporate entity to co-sign the debt. He needed me. He assumed he could utilize the tax identification numbers he scraped together during his failed catering bid. He forged my digital signature, leveraging the sterling reputation of my logistics firm to guarantee the country club's invoice. The sheer audacity of the felony left me momentarily breathless. I stepped closer to the monitor, examining the digital ink. "This is not my signature," I said, my voice eerily calm despite the erratic hammering in my chest, "and I never authorized this vendor agreement." "I know," Jonathan replied, leaning back in his chair. "The digital footprint on the submission IP address traces back to a public network, just like the forged emails he tried to use against you 2 weeks ago. He is getting desperate, Hope. He committed wire fraud, identity theft, and corporate forgery in a single keystroke." I stared at the forged letters on the screen, piecing together the psychological mechanics of his gamble. Carter was a desperate, cornered animal, but he possessed a cunning understanding of toxic family dynamics. He committed this crime relying on a very specific, deeply ingrained assumption. He assumed I would discover the $80,000 charge and choose to stay quiet. He banked on the expectation that I would simply eat the cost or quietly settle the debt to avoid subjecting my parents to a devastating public scandal. In his mind, the old rules still applied. He thought the obedient background daughter would always fall on her sword to protect the golden child's perfect image. He believed family secrets stayed buried in the dark, smothered by the fear of social embarrassment. He was incredibly, fatally wrong. The era of keeping the peace was dead. He had dragged my hard-earned professional empire into his fraudulent blast radius, and I was not going to quietly absorb his shrapnel. "What is the status of this contract?" I asked, turning to face the senior counsel. "The venue management accepted the forged signature yesterday," Jonathan explained, crossing his arms. "They granted the credit line. The event is scheduled to take place tonight." Tonight. The word echoed in the sterile office. The lavish Savannah engagement party, the grand societal debut Joanne had boasted about, the event funded by stolen equity and corporate fraud, was happening in a matter of hours. Carter and Melody were currently preparing to stand under a floral arch and toast to their manufactured prestige, entirely unaware that the financial floorboards were about to rot away beneath their feet. Jonathan walked over to his desk and picked up a legal pad. "We need to contact the local authorities down in Chatham County immediately," he stated, his pen poised over the paper. "We can file a remote police report for identity theft and let law enforcement handle the venue management. We will draft a standard cease and desist and email it to the country club's administrative office." "No," I said. Jonathan stopped writing, looking up at me in surprise. "Hope, this is a felony. We have to report the fraud." "We are going to report it," I corrected, my tone sharpening into a surgical blade. "But sending an email to a generic administrative inbox on a Friday afternoon guarantees it will sit unread until Monday morning. By then, the event is over, the $80,000 is spent, and the studio is left fighting a protracted legal battle to void a fulfilled service contract. Carter gets his party, and we get the headache." I walked over to the desk, placing my hands flat on the polished surface. I am not letting him enjoy a single second of that event. I want to execute a lethal legal strike. Jonathan studied my face, recognizing the unyielding resolve in my posture. "What do you have in mind?" "We are not just drafting a cease and desist," I instructed, the logistical gears in my mind shifting into overdrive. "We are going to prepare a comprehensive injunction. We will compile the undeniable proof of his forgery, the studio security bans, and the active civil judgments. We will bind it all into a certified legal notice terminating the venue contract effective immediately." And how do you plan to ensure the venue management receives and acts on this notice before the event concludes? Jonathan asked, raising an eyebrow. I looked at the digital clock on the wall. It was just past 1 in the afternoon. Savannah was a 4-hour drive from Atlanta. I am going to deliver it to them personally, I said. A heavy electric silence filled the legal office. Crashing an elite social event to serve corporate litigation was highly unconventional, but it was the only way to guarantee the immediate cessation of the fraudulent contract. It was the only way to ensure Carter could not charm or manipulate his way out of the consequences. I am going to drive down to the coast, I continued, my voice steady and resolute. I will hand the injunction directly to the country club's general manager. I will inform them that their financial guarantor is a victim of identity theft, and their client is a serial felon. Jonathan slowly lowered his pen. He let out a low whistle, a rare display of genuine astonishment from the seasoned attorney. You realize what this means, Hope. Delivering this notice mid-event will result in the immediate cancellation of the party. The venue will likely call security to clear the ballroom to limit their own liability. It will be a total, unmitigated disaster for your family. I know, I replied, feeling a profound, chilling peace settle over my conscience. Carter assumed I would suffer in silence to protect the illusion. Tonight, I am bringing the absolute wrath of corporate litigation down upon the Golden Child's perfect evening. Jonathan did not argue further. He recognized the shift in my posture, the cold calculation that had replaced any lingering familial hesitation. He turned back to his dual monitors, his fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. He pulled up the standard corporate injunction templates, preparing to draft a generic notice of termination. I stopped him, placing my hand flat on the edge of his desk. Do not use the standard template, I instructed, my voice steady. Pull up the master vendor agreement, navigate to section 4, paragraph 12. Jonathan paused, his brow furrowing as he clicked through the secure legal drive. He found the specified document and scrolled down. His eyes scanned the text, widening marginally as he read the dense legal framework I had directed him toward. 3 years ago, during my first quarter managing procurement, a fraudulent freight forwarder attempted to scam the studio using a spoofed line of credit. The ensuing legal battle took months to resolve, costing us thousands in retainer fees. I swore I would never leave my department exposed to that kind of vulnerability again. I spent 2 weeks locked in a conference room with our lead attorneys, drafting an ironclad countermeasure. We called it the Fraud and Liability Clause. It was a draconian piece of corporate policy designed for one specific purpose. The clause stipulated that if any vendor, contractor, or external entity utilized our corporate identification numbers to secure unauthorized credit, the studio retained the immediate, non-negotiable right to seize control of the fraudulent contract. We could freeze the associated assets, void the agreements, and hold the venue or service provider harmless, effectively pulling the financial rug out from under the scammer in a matter of seconds. By forging my signature and using my company's tax identification, Carter did not just commit a crime, he inadvertently bound himself to our terms of service. Jonathan looked up from the screen, a sharp, impressed smile breaking through his serious demeanor. You built a trapdoor into the supply chain network, he murmured. Print it, I said. Attach the forged country club contract, the security bands, and his credit report. Bind it all together. The heavy-duty laser printer in the corner of the office hummed to life, churning out the pages that would end my sister's fairy tale. Jonathan arranged the documents with meticulous care. The sharp, metallic thwack of his heavy-duty stapler echoed through the room, sounding like a gavel striking a block. Each staple felt like a nail sealing a coffin. He slid the thick, undeniable stack of evidence into a pristine white envelope, sealing the flap with a firm press of his thumb. The studio's silver-embossed logo gleamed on the front. He handed the envelope across the desk. Good luck, Hope. I took the envelope, feeling its substantial weight. I did not say thank you. I simply nodded, turned on my heel, and walked out of the legal department. The polished steel doors of the executive elevator slid shut, sealing me inside the quiet, mirrored cabin. I stood alone as the car descended toward the lobby. I looked at my reflection in the glass. The woman staring back at me did not resemble the girl who sat in the stadium folding chair waiting for her parents to applaud. That girl was eager, accommodating, and desperate for validation. The woman in the mirror was a chief executive protecting her empire. Her spine was straight, her gaze was steely and impenetrable. I walked out of the studio lot and drove straight to my midtown apartment. I had less than an hour to prepare for a 4-hour drive to the coast. I bypassed my usual work attire and walked into my closet. My family always equated wealth with noise. Joanne favored loud, chaotic prints, heavy costume jewelry, and colors that demanded attention but lacked any real substance. Melody dressed in layers of tulle, sequins, and pastels, presenting herself as a delicate, fragile artist requiring constant protection and financial sponsorship. Their aesthetic was a desperate performance. I reached past my standard business suits and pulled out a structured, charcoal gray designer sheath dress. It featured sharp architectural lines, a high neckline, and a flawless tailored fit. It was understated, powerful, and utterly devoid of excess. It was the armor of a woman who did not need to scream to command a room. I paired it with a simple pair of black leather pumps and secured my hair into a sleek, unforgiving twist. I grabbed my car keys, the white corporate envelope, and walked out the door. The drive from Atlanta to Savannah requires a long, solitary journey down Interstate 75, merging onto Interstate 16. It is a straight, hypnotic stretch of asphalt cutting through the heart of Georgia. I set the cruise control, the engine humming a steady, relentless rhythm beneath me. As the miles vanished in the rear-view mirror, the landscape outside my windows began to shift. The towering concrete skyline of the city gave way to rolling hills, which eventually flattened into the dense, humid pine forests of the southern coastal plain. The air growing heavier, thicker with the impending proximity of the ocean. I sat in the quiet cabin of my sedan, the white envelope resting on the passenger seat next to me. A lesser person might have spent the 4-hour drive rehearsing a dramatic speech. They might have practiced screaming, crying, or demanding apologies from the people who betrayed them. I did none of those things. I felt no urge to yell. I did not want to cry. Anger requires an emotional investment, and my family had long ago bankrupted my reserves. My mind remained locked in a state of cold, strategic execution. I visualized the layout of a standard country club ballroom. I anticipated the positions of the venue management, the location of the main stage, the probable placement of the security personnel. I was plotting a legally binding corporate takeover of a high society social event. Carter believed his fake charm and borrowed money made him untouchable. He assumed that inserting himself into my family granted him immunity from the real world. He forgot that the real world operates on contracts, liabilities, and undeniable proof. The sun began its slow descent as I reached the outskirts of Savannah. The sky turned a bruised shade of purple, casting long, dramatic shadows across the marshlands. Spanish moss draped heavily from the branches of ancient oak trees, swaying gently in the warm, salty evening breeze. The city possessed a deep, historic charm, a facade of polite Southern elegance masking the tangled, murky roots beneath the surface. It was the perfect setting for a fabricated fairy tale. I navigated my car through the ornate iron gates of the elite country club. The driveway was lined with flickering gas lanterns, illuminating a long line of luxury vehicles waiting for the valet. The grand clubhouse loomed at the end of the path, a sprawling antebellum-style mansion boasting white pillars and expansive wraparound porches. I pulled my modest sedan up to the front portico, standing in stark contrast to the imported sports cars and stretched limousines surrounding me. A valet attendant in a crisp uniform rushed forward, opening my door with a practiced, polite greeting. I stepped out of the vehicle, my heels clicking sharply against the cobblestone drive. Faint strains of classical music drifted through the warm night air, mingling with the sound of clinking glass and joyous laughter spilling from the open ballroom doors. The engagement gala was in full swing. 150 influential guests were currently sipping expensive champagne, celebrating the union of a delusional golden child and a desperate serial felon. I handed my keys to the valet. I picked up the pristine white envelope from the passenger seat, my fingers gripping the thick paper. The anticipation hung thick in the humid air, wrapping around me like a second skin. I did not pause to adjust my dress or take a calming breath. I walked past the grand fountain, ascending the wide marble steps toward the towering entrance doors. The music grew louder, the bright golden light from the crystal chandeliers spilling out onto the porch. I was about to step into the center of their manufactured perfection, armed with the one thing they spent their entire lives running from, the truth. And they had no idea the storm was already standing on their threshold. The heavy brass handles of the Savannah Country Club ballroom doors felt cool against my palms. I pushed them open, stepping from the quiet carpeted corridor into a blinding theater of manufactured opulence. The grand hall revealed a spectacle funded by stolen equity and forged signatures. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden radiance over 150 attendees. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos navigated a sea of floor-length gowns and tailored suits, balancing silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and caviar canapés. The scent of expensive perfume mingled with the aroma of roasted tenderloin and fresh orchids. I stood at the threshold, taking in the scale of the delusion. Aunt Susan stood near a towering ice sculpture shaped like a swan, laughing with a group of women who had likely spent the past 2 weeks analyzing my perceived failures. Uncle Ben held court near the mahogany bar, swirling amber liquid in a crystal glass, smoking a cigar he could not afford on his mechanic's salary. And scattered among my extended relatives were Carter's supposed investors. They wore flashy watches and sipped top-shelf liquor, playing their roles in a grand charade of false wealth. The string quartet tucked in the far corner played a lively, sophisticated classical piece. The music provided a seamless soundtrack to the grand illusion. I stepped across the threshold, letting the heavy doors shut behind me. The heels of my black leather pumps struck the polished marble floor with a sharp, rhythmic cadence. The shift in the room did not happen all at once. It rippled outward, a quiet wave of disruption spreading through the crowd. A waiter near the entrance paused in mid-stride, turning his head. Aunt Susan caught sight of my charcoal gray designer dress, and her jaw went slack. Her laughter died in her throat, replaced by a look of sheer scandal. The whispers started near the back, traveling swiftly through the wealthy neighbors and confused investors. The cellist in the quartet noticed the shifting attention. His bow faltered, hitting a sour, discordant note. The violinist stopped playing a second later. Within 10 seconds, the lively music ground to a jarring, uncomfortable halt. The cheerful clinking of crystal flutes ceased. 150 pairs of eyes turned toward the entrance, locking onto my solitary figure. I did not stop walking. I maintained a steady, measured pace, holding the pristine white corporate envelope at my side. David stood near the center of the room, holding a silver microphone. He was likely preparing to deliver a speech about leveraging equity and supporting the arts, ready to bask in the adoration of his peers. He looked up, tracing the collective gaze of his guests toward the doorway. When his eyes found me, the joyful, proud expression of the wealthy benefactor vanished in an instant. His face morphed into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. A dark, angry flush crept up from his stiff white collar, coloring his cheeks and his forehead. I could see the prominent vein pulsing near his temple, throbbing with sudden hypertension. He thrust the microphone into the hands of a bewildered waiter and marched across the marble floor. His strides were long and intimidating, designed to force compliance through physical presence alone. For 22 years, that specific walk signaled an impending lecture, a demand for immediate obedience, a command to shrink myself into a convenient, quiet corner. He intercepted me halfway to the stage. He did not yell, preserving the last shred of his country club decorum, but his voice was a venomous, hushed hiss meant only for my ears. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, stepping directly into my path to block my progress. "You were explicitly told you are not welcome at this event." I stopped, looking up at the man who had abandoned my college graduation to fund a fraud. His breath smelled of expensive scotch and cigars. I felt no fear. The intimidation tactics that worked on a desperate, approval-seeking child held zero power over a corporate executive executing a legal strike. "I am here on business, David," I replied, my voice a glacial, even monotone. "You are here to ruin your sister's night because you cannot stand seeing someone else happy?" he growled, stepping closer, attempting to use his height to force a retreat. "I want you out of this building right now. If you do not turn around and walk out those doors, I will have security physically drag you into the parking lot. Do not test me, Hope. You will regret it." The old version of me would have flinched. The old version would have internalized the rejection, turned around, and cried in the driver's seat of my car. I looked at his clenched fists. I looked at the veins standing out on his neck. Then I simply sidestepped him. I did not argue. I did not engage in a petty suburban shouting match. I stepped around his imposing frame with the effortless grace of someone dodging a minor, insignificant obstacle on a sidewalk. David gasped, stunned by the blatant dismissal. He reached out to grab my arm, but I was already moving past him, my focus locked on the elevated stage at the front of the ballroom. Melody and Carter stood beneath a sprawling arch composed of imported white roses and cascading orchids. It was a breathtaking floral arrangement, paid for by a second mortgage and a forged line of credit. Melody wore a custom silk gown that pooled around her feet, sparkling under the chandelier light. Carter wore a tailored tuxedo, playing the role of the visionary music producer to perfection. When Melody realized I was bypassing our father and heading straight for her stage, the delicate, fragile artist persona shattered into pieces. The golden child, accustomed to a world that bowed to her every whim, lost her temper in front of the entire assembly. Since childhood, theatrical tears and screaming fits were her preferred weapons to maintain control. She stomped her silver heel against the wooden platform. "What is she doing here?" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly through the cavernous hall. Her face twisted into a mask of dramatic agony, pointing a manicured finger at me. "Carter, make her leave. She is trying to ruin my engagement. She is so jealous she cannot even let me have one single night of happiness." Carter stepped forward, puffing out his chest to shield his bride-to-be. He raised a hand, attempting to project calm authority to his wealthy investors watching from the floor. "Now listen here, Hope," he began, flashing that familiar, oily smile. "This is a private celebration. You need to respect your family's boundaries and exit the premises before things get ugly. We do not want to call the police on you." I reached the base of the stage. The entire room held its breath. The silence was so profound I could hear the faint rustle of silk gowns and the nervous shifting of leather dress shoes on the marble floor. 150 guests watched in captivated horror, anticipating a trashy, emotional family feud. I did not give them a screaming match. I gave them a corporate execution. I lifted my arm and handed the thick, sealed white envelope across the floral arrangements, pressing it directly against Carter's chest. He instinctually brought his hands up to grasp it. "What is this?" he muttered, his oily smile faltering as he felt the substantial weight of the legal documents inside. I took a half step back, ensuring my posture was perfectly straight. I did not need a microphone. The acoustic design of the grand ballroom carried my voice with crisp, undeniable clarity to every single person in the room. "You forged my company's name for an $80,000 line of credit," I announced. The words hung in the air, sharp and lethal. I kept my gaze locked on Carter, watching the color drain from his face, before turning my attention to the breathless crowd. "The venue management has been notified. The contract is void. This engagement party is currently operating on stolen funds, and the authorities have been dispatched to investigate felony identity theft." The collective intake of breath from the audience sounded like a vacuum sealing the room. The illusion fractured, the cracks spreading rapidly through the crystal chandeliers, the imported roses, and the tailored suits exposing the rot underneath. A sharp, hollow bark of laughter erupted from Carter. The sound bounced off the vaulted ceiling, striking the silent room with an unnatural, forced cadence. He did not open the envelope in his hands. Instead, he pivoted toward the audience, spreading his arms in a theatrical gesture of mock surrender. His oily smile returned, though the edges trembled under the harsh chandelier lighting. "Ladies and gentlemen, I must sincerely apologize for this unexpected intermission," he announced, his voice adopting a patronizing, soothing tone. "My future sister-in-law has been struggling with extreme psychological stress at her shipping job. We have tried to get her the help she needs, but unfortunately, these tragic, delusional outbursts continue to happen. Please bear with us while we handle this private family matter." He was playing the ultimate gaslighting card, attempting to weaponize my quiet nature against me. The strategy relied on the crowd wanting to believe the beautiful illusion rather than face a messy, uncomfortable reality. A few sympathetic murmurs rippled through the front rows. Aunt Susan clutched her pearl necklace, nodding in grim agreement with his assessment of my mental state. Carter looked back at me, his eyes gleaming with a frantic, triumphant malice. He thought his silver tongue could smooth over a federal felony. He failed to realize I never walk into a negotiation with only one copy of the contract. I reached into my charcoal designer bag and extracted a secondary duplicate manila folder. I did not raise my voice to shout over his performance. I simply bypassed him and extended the folder toward the one person whose financial ruin was intricately tied to this charade. David stood frozen a few feet away, his fists clenched at his sides. I held the folder out to him. "Read it," I instructed, my tone possessing the icy authority of a seasoned corporate executive. "Read the signature on the venue guarantee, then read the credit report attached behind it." David hesitated, his rigid posture warring against the undeniable seed of doubt I had just planted. But the instinct of a man who obsessed over his own wealth won out. He snatched the folder from my hand. He flipped open the heavy cover, his eyes darting to the first page, the venue financing contract. While my father scanned the forged digital ink, I turned my attention back to the captive audience. "Carter claims I am delusional," I said, projecting my voice to reach the very back of the hall. "Let us examine the facts supporting his grand European conservatory tour. The man standing on this stage pitching investments to half this room is named Carter Sterling. He is not a music producer. He is a failed freelance location scout who currently holds 3 active civil judgments for breach of contract." "Stop talking," Carter hissed, dropping the white envelope onto the stage floor. He lunged forward, his previous composed facade cracking, but I held my ground, unblinking, untethered by his intimidation. "His total outstanding debt currently sits at $342,000, I continued, the exact staggering 6-figure sum ringing out across the silent country club. "He has defaulted on 7 separate personal loans. The luxury sedan he parked in this very lot is marked for immediate repossession. He forged my corporate signature to secure this ballroom because his own credit score is bordering on total insolvency." The murmurs in the crowd shifted instantly. Sympathy evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating shock. The wealthy individuals Carter had spent the evening grooming, the affluent marks he targeted to fund his next grift, began to piece the puzzle together. I watched a prominent real estate developer in the third row, a man Carter had been cornering near the bar earlier, set his crystal tumbler down on a passing waiter's tray. The developer exchanged a sharp, knowing glance with his wife. Furthermore, I stated relentless in my delivery. Carter Sterling is permanently banned from the premises of the largest film studio in Georgia. Studio security escorted him off the lot last Tuesday after we uncovered his attempt to frame me for corporate extortion, all because I rejected his desperate bid to provide low-level craft services for a zombie movie. Carter was unraveling in real time. The sweat that had formed at his hairline now poured down his temples, soaking into the cheap collar of his rented tuxedo. His eyes darted frantically around the room, searching the faces of his guests for a single lifeline, a single person who still believed the fantasy. He found none. The exodus began near the mahogany bar. The real estate developer buttoned his suit jacket, placed a protective hand on his wife's lower back, and walked briskly toward the exit. A domino effect ensued. The men in expensive suits, the supposed investors Carter had promised grand returns on Melody's non-existent tour, realized they were standing in the middle of a sinking ship. They recognized a scam the moment the financial receipts were laid bare. Within 60 seconds, a dozen of Savannah's most influential residents turned their backs and walked out the grand mahogany doors in utter disgust. The social capital Joanne had spent her entire adult life hoarding vanished alongside them. My mother stood near the towering swan ice sculpture, her face drained of all color. The women she had spent the evening impressing were currently stepping away from her, creating a wide, isolating circle of sheer embarrassment. The reality of her sudden social ruin hit her with physical force. Her knees buckled, she stumbled backward, her manicured hands grasping blindly until she collapsed heavily into a green velvet accent chair. She stared at the marble floor, her breath coming in short, erratic gasps, unable to process the destruction of her flawless suburban image. But Joanne's humiliation was merely the opening act. The true tragedy belonged to the man holding the manila folder. David flipped to the second page, then the third. His hands, usually so steady and commanding, began to shake uncontrollably. The paper rattled in his grip. He read the credit reports, the active civil judgments, and the studio security ban. The irrefutable, terrifying truth settled over him, suffocating his pride. He had marched into a bank 2 weeks ago, blinded by his own ego, and signed away the deed to his home. He had extracted $150,000 in equity and wired it directly into the accounts of a serial felon. The grand European Conservatory tour, the prestigious engagements in Paris and Vienna, the elite status he craved, none of it existed. He had traded his family's entire financial security for a worthless, fabricated illusion. David slowly lowered the folder. The fierce, unyielding patriarch who had demanded my obedience at a steakhouse was gone, replaced by a hollow, defeated old man. His skin turned a sickly shade of gray. He looked up, his eyes bypassing me entirely, locking onto the man standing on the stage. The shift in the room was palpable. The target of David's infamous wrath transitioned. I was no longer the difficult daughter ruining a celebration. Carter was the architect of his demise. David took a slow, menacing step toward the floral arch the forged contract crumpled in his trembling fist. He opened his mouth, ready to unleash a lifetime of authoritarian rage upon the man who had stolen his retirement. The confrontation seemed inevitable. The entire ballroom braced for the physical collapse of the golden child's perfect union. Everyone expected Melody to faint, to weep, to collapse into her father's arms, seeking protection from the monster she had unwittingly brought into their lives. We all waited for the fragile artist to shatter, but in the world of toxic family dynamics, the most dangerous parasites are rarely the outsiders. They are the ones you raised, and Melody was about to prove she was far from an innocent victim in this grift. David moved toward the elevated platform with the slow, rigid gait of a man walking to an execution. The crumpled manila folder shook in his trembling fist. The polished patriarch, the man who had confidently boasted about leveraging equity over a seared ribeye, was entirely gone. In his place stood a hollowed-out husk confronting the architect of his financial ruin. The remaining guests in the Savannah ballroom held their collective breath. The silence grew so dense it felt physical. Everyone anticipated the standard script for a public scandal. We all waited for Melody to play her designated role. The fragile, sheltered artist was supposed to collapse. She was supposed to cover her mouth in horror, weep delicate tears, and throw herself into her father's protective embrace. We expected her to portray the innocent maiden deceived by a cunning predator. But toxic family systems do not produce innocent maidens. They produce individuals groomed to extract whatever they need to maintain their unearned status. As David reached the edge of the stage, drawing a breath to unleash his fury upon Carter, the golden child shattered the script. Melody did not faint. She did not cry. She did not reach for her father. She turned her back on David and rounded on her fiancé. Her face, previously arranged into a picture of glowing bridal joy, twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. Her silk gown rustled sharply as she closed the distance between them. "You promised me my parents' money would cover the rest of your debt," she screamed. The sheer malice in her shriek echoed off the vaulted ceiling, striking the silent ballroom like a physical blow. The words hung in the humid air, lethal and undeniable. A collective gasp swept through the remaining guests. Aunt Susan pressed a hand to her chest, her eyes wide with unvarnished shock. The caterers froze near the kitchen doors. Melody knew. She knew Carter was broke the entire time. The pristine, talented flutist was not a victim of a grand con. She was a willing, active co-conspirator. "Keep your voice down," Carter hissed, his face flushing a frantic, panicked red. He reached out to grab her arm, desperate to salvage any shred of dignity in front of the wealthy onlookers. "Do not touch me," Melody shrieked, swatting his hand away with a fierce striking motion. "You swore to me. We took $150,000 from them. You looked me in the eye and said that was enough liquid cash to pay off your civil judgments and secure this country club for the night. You said nobody would ever find out about the catering bids or the repossessions." "Melody, shut up," Carter pleaded, his oily veneer entirely stripped away, exposing the pathetic, desperate fraud underneath. "You are ruining everything." "You ruined it," she fired back, her voice climbing to a hysterical pitch. "I did my part. I convinced them the European tour was real. I played the dutiful daughter. I sat in that miserable suburban house and listened to Joanne brag about my fake career so we could extract their retirement funds. I secured your payoff. And you still had to forge my sister's corporate signature just to rent a ballroom? You are useless." The horrific truth laid itself bare under the glare of the crystal chandeliers. Melody had orchestrated her own parents' financial destruction. For 22 years, David and Joanne had worshipped at her altar. They funded her private lessons, purchased her imported instruments, and sacrificed my college graduation to attend a local theater recital. They groomed her to believe she was royalty, immune to the struggles of practical working-class citizens. They raised a parasite. When Melody realized her artistic talent would never yield the high society lifestyle she felt entitled to, she refused to adjust her expectations. She found a con artist who spoke her language of unearned prestige. Together, they calculated exactly how to drain her parents' life savings to fund her delusion of grandeur. She viewed David and Joanne not as loving parents, but as a bank vault waiting to be cracked. David stood at the base of the stage, the crumpled folder slipping from his lax fingers. The paper hit the marble floor with a soft, dismissive thud. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. He raised a trembling hand, clutching the fabric of his shirt over his chest. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The realization hit him with staggering physical force. The daughter he idolized, the child he had abandoned me for, viewed him as nothing more than an exploitable mark. His worldview, constructed entirely on the foundation of her imagined perfection, crumbled into dust. A sharp, agonizing sob fractured the quiet room. Joanne remained collapsed in the green velvet chair. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with erratic, uncontrollable heaves. The suburban socialite who had orchestrated a vicious smear campaign against me just weeks prior was now weeping openly in front of her neighbors and extended relatives. Her flawless image was dead. The country club peers she spent her life trying to impress were currently staring at her with a mixture of pity and profound revulsion. I stood amidst the wreckage of my family. The air conditioning chilled the damp skin on my arms, but I felt a profound, radiant heat building in my chest. I looked at David clutching his heart. I looked at Joanne sobbing into her palms. I looked at Melody, her beautiful face distorted by greed and rage, standing next to the fraud she chose over her own blood. I felt no pity. For over 2 decades, I internalized their neglect. I believed my lack of artistic flair made me unworthy of their time. I thought my practical nature, my logistical mindset, and my corporate ambitions were inherent flaws. I spent my childhood making myself small, quiet, and self-sufficient, hoping that if I demanded nothing, they might eventually offer a scrap of genuine affection. But watching Melody scream at her partner in crime, demanding the lifestyle she stole from her parents' equity, the final chain binding me to this toxic dynamic snapped. They did not abandon me because I was lacking. They abandoned me because I was real. I required genuine connection, and they only possessed the capacity for superficial performance. They invested their entire souls into a mirage, and now they were dying of thirst in the desert they created. The validation was cold, hard, and undeniably liberating. The heavy, suffocating weight of seeking their approval lifted from my shoulders, evaporating into the high ceilings of the country club. Carter, realizing his fiancée had just confessed to felony fraud in front of 100 witnesses, decided to deploy his final survival tactic. He turned on her. "You crazy, spoiled brat," he spat, stepping away from the floral arch. "You pushed me into this. You demanded the Savannah venue. You said your parents were too stupid to ever check the bank statements. Do not try to pin this entire operation on me. You are just as guilty." Melody let out a feral, wordless scream and lunged toward him. I did not wait to watch the physical altercation unfold. The emotional execution was complete. The illusion was dead, but my work for the evening was far from over. The emotional devastation of my family was merely a byproduct of my true objective. I drove 4 hours to this coastal city to protect my logistics empire, and the legal mechanism of that protection had yet to be fully deployed. I turned my back on the stage, leaving the screaming golden child and the hyperventilating patriarch behind me. I walked calmly toward the grand mahogany doors, scanning the periphery of the room for the one individual who held the operational authority over this venue. I spotted the general manager standing near the kitchen entrance. He was a tall, distinguished man wearing a tailored suit, a silver name tag pinned to his lapel. He was currently speaking frantically into a handheld radio, his eyes darting toward the escalating chaos on his main stage. I adjusted my grip on the pristine white envelope containing my corporate injunction. The The family drama had concluded. It was time to execute the legal eviction. I crossed the polished marble floor, my heels striking a steady, rhythmic beat against the lingering murmurs of the stunned crowd. The general manager stood near the swinging kitchen double doors. His silver name tag read Arthur, Director of Operations. He gripped a handheld radio tightly, his knuckles pale, watching the shouting match on the stage with mounting panic. A country club of this caliber thrived on discretion and seamless elegance. A public brawl involving felony fraud and screaming brides threatened the very foundation of their pristine reputation. I stopped directly in front of him, intercepting his frantic line of sight. He blinked, registering my charcoal designer dress and the calm, unwavering authority radiating from my posture. I held out the crisp white envelope bearing my studio's embossed silver logo. He took it hesitantly, his eyes darting between my face and the heavy paper. I informed him that the financial guarantor for tonight's event was a victim of identity theft. I explained that the man shouting on his stage had forged my corporate signature to secure the $80,000 credit line. Arthur ripped open the flap. He pulled out the injunction, scanning the ironclad legal text drafted by my senior counsel. He read the fraud and liability clause, tracing the lines detailing how my logistics firm retained the non-negotiable right to seize control of any fraudulent contract bearing our identification numbers. His eyes darted from the legal text back to my face. The liability shifted in real time. If he allowed the party to continue, the venue absorbed a staggering financial loss, as the original contract was built on criminal forgery. If he honored my corporate injunction, my firm assumed temporary control of the agreement, covering the operational costs to offset our own legal damages and preventing the club from taking a total loss. Arthur was a pragmatic businessman running a tight margin operation. He gave a sharp, decisive nod. He raised his radio to his mouth and summoned the entire security detail to the main ballroom. Then he gestured toward the stage, granting me the floor. I walked back toward the floral arch. Melody and Carter were still trading venomous insults, entirely oblivious to the shifting tide. David remained frozen near the steps, a hollow shell of his former authoritarian self. Joanne sat slumped in her velvet chair in the distance, hiding her ruined makeup behind her trembling hands. I picked up the silver microphone David had discarded earlier. The electronic feedback let out a short, sharp squeal, cutting through the bitter arguing. Melody snapped her mouth shut, glaring at me with raw hatred, her chest heaving under the silk fabric of her gown. I did not look at my sister. I addressed the remaining guests and the venue staff. "This engagement party is officially canceled," I announced, my voice steady and resonant, echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. "The contract securing this space has been legally seized by my corporate holding company due to fraudulent activity." I turned my attention to the uniformed security guards marching through the grand entrance. "Please escort Carter Sterling, Melody Barnes, David Barnes, and Joanne Barnes off the premises immediately." The eviction was swift and devoid of any lingering dignity. The guards flanked my father first. David did not resist. He walked toward the exit with a slow, shuffling gait, his expensive leather shoes dragging heavily against the marble floor. The fierce patriarch who had spent his life demanding obedience and projecting superior wealth was reduced to a broken man, bankrupted by his own blind favoritism. Joanne needed assistance standing up. A young security guard guided her by the elbow as she sobbed into her palms. She kept her head bowed, unable to meet the eyes of the few affluent neighbors who remained to witness her stunning fall from grace. Her flawless suburban image lay shattered on the floor, replaced by the grim reality of impending foreclosure. Carter attempted to argue. He spouted desperate, hollow legal threats, pointing a shaking finger at the venue manager, but two burly guards gripped his shoulders. They marched him forcefully toward the glass doors, ignoring his pathetic blustering. His faux designer tuxedo looked rumpled and cheap under the harsh glare of the foyer lights. Melody threw one final theatrical tantrum. She stomped her silver heels, shrieking my name, demanding I stop the guards. She commanded the room to listen to her, clinging to the delusional belief that her tears still held power. The guards simply flanked her sides, ushering her forward with polite, unyielding pressure. She fought the escort all the way to the threshold, her screams echoing through the corridor until the heavy brass doors shut behind her, cutting off her voice entirely. The ballroom felt remarkably light. The toxic weight that had suffocated me for 22 years evaporated into the chilled air. The venue staff moved with sudden, efficient purpose. Waiters began stripping the personalized engagement banners from the walls. The custom napkins bearing Melody and Carter's initials were gathered and swiftly discarded. But the night was not over. I had driven 4 hours to protect my empire, and I intended to utilize the lavish space I now legally controlled. I pulled out my phone and sent a single text message. 10 seconds later, the grand mahogany doors swung open again. A group of 20 people walked into the hall. They did not wear restrictive tuxedos or gaudy ball gowns. They wore tailored business casual attire, carrying themselves with the relaxed, genuine confidence of people who earn their living through competence and hard work. They were my logistics team, my corporate colleagues, the supply chain managers and freight coordinators who had driven down from Atlanta anticipating a successful legal strike. I had rented a nearby block of hotel rooms for them, instructing them to wait for my signal. These were the people who celebrated my promotions, who supported my long hours, and who recognized my value without requiring a financial sacrifice. They were my chosen family. They walked into the opulent space, their eyes widening at the crystal chandeliers and the towering floral arrangements. My lead coordinator, a brilliant woman named Sarah, who managed our international shipping routes, walked up to the stage and handed me a fresh glass of chilled champagne. The transition was seamless. The venue manager instructed the string quartet to resume playing, shifting their repertoire from tense classical movements to upbeat celebratory jazz. The waiters pivoted smoothly, carrying silver trays of high-end caviar and roasted tenderloin directly to my corporate staff. I stood beneath the sprawling arch of imported white roses and cascading orchids, the very structure meant to frame my sister's unearned fairy tale. The flowers smelled rich and sweet, a fitting backdrop for a victory hard won. I raised my crystal flute. My team turned their attention toward the stage, raising their glasses in unison. We toasted to supply chain efficiency, to corporate integrity, and to the relentless pursuit of truth. The champagne tasted crisp, cold, and undeniably satisfying. I looked out over the ballroom, watching my colleagues enjoy the decadent feast funded by a shattered illusion. The victory was total. I had reclaimed my narrative, executed a flawless corporate takeover, and purged the parasites from my life. But the consequences of Carter's felony forgery were just beginning to ripple outward. The legal and financial fallout awaiting my parents in the harsh light of morning would demand a severe reckoning, forcing them to face a harsh reality they could no longer outrun. The weeks following the Savannah Country Club eviction unfolded with a quiet, relentless precision. I returned to my executive office in Atlanta, immersing myself in the familiar rhythms of supply chain management. The air conditioning hummed its steady tune, and the digital freight schedules updated across my dual monitors. But a new fixture had appeared in my pristine corporate sanctuary. On the corner of my glass desk, the voicemail indicator on my secure landline flashed a persistent rhythmic red. It was a small, pulsing LED light. Yet it represented the dying breaths of a toxic dynasty. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and pressed the speaker button. The automated system announced a saved message. David's voice filled the quiet room, stripped of its usual booming authoritarian resonance. The polished patriarch who once demanded apologies over seared ribeye now sounded frail, breathless, and terrified. "Hope," he began, a noticeable tremor vibrating beneath his words. "We are in a difficult spot. The bank is demanding the first installment on the new equity loan, and our liquid funds are tied up. We just need a temporary family loan, a bridge just to get us through the quarter until things settle down. You know we would do the same for you. Please call your mother. We are family." I sat still, listening to the static hiss on the line after he finished speaking. A temporary family loan. The phrase was a thinly veiled trap, a desperate hook designed to drag me right back into the wreckage they had engineered. He did not apologize for abandoning my graduation. He did not express remorse for funding a con artist who forged my corporate identity. He only reached out because the consequences of his blind favoritism had finally arrived at his doorstep, holding an invoice he could not afford. In the past, the tremor in his voice would have triggered an ingrained biological response. I would have felt the overwhelming urge to fix their mistakes, to buy their conditional affection by sacrificing my own stability. I looked at the flashing red light. I felt no guilt. I felt no obligation. I reached forward and pressed the delete button. The digital voice recording vanished into the ether and the red light went dark. The boundary remained ironclad, impenetrable. The reality of their situation was far too severe for a temporary bridge loan to fix. Carter, realizing the full scope of the corporate litigation and criminal charges bearing down upon him, did what parasites always do when the host runs dry. He fled. Under the cover of darkness, he abandoned his rented apartment, ditched his repossessed luxury sedan, and crossed state lines. He disappeared into the sprawling anonymity of the American highway system, leaving behind a trail of bounced checks, unpaid vendors, and an active felony arrest warrant issued by Chatham County law enforcement for identity theft and wire fraud. He left Melody holding the bag. The golden child, the fragile artist groomed to expect a life of unearned luxury, suddenly found herself thrust into the harsh, unforgiving glare of a federal investigation. Because she had actively participated in the deception, confirming the fake European tour to extract the home equity funds, local detectives labeled her a person of interest. The social humiliation was swift and merciless. Plainclothes investigators arrived at the sprawling suburban brick colonial, knocking on the pristine mahogany door with search warrants in hand. They confiscated Melody's electronics, parsing through her text messages and emails to determine her exact level of complicity in the $80,000 venue forgery. The high society peers she had spent her life trying to impress watched from behind their drawn curtains. The rumors spread through the affluent neighborhood like wildfire. Her country club invitations vanished. The affluent friends who attended her disastrous engagement party blocked her phone number, terrified of being associated with an active criminal probe. The pristine pedestal my parents had built for her crumbled into dust, leaving a terrified, disgraced woman facing the very real threat of accessory charges. But the criminal investigation was only one front in a multi-front war. The financial time bomb David and Joanne had armed in their home office finally detonated. The regional bank that issued the $150,000 second mortgage did not care about fabricated music tours or fugitive fiancés. They operated on a strict, emotionless ledger. When the first staggering monthly payment came due, David's account sat empty. When the second month passed without a deposit, the lender initiated the formal default process. The foreclosure notices arrived in the mail, printed on stark, unforgiving legal paper. The documents detailed the impending public auction of the property, the house that served as the grand stage for their optical perfection, the residence where I spent 18 years feeling invisible, was reclaimed by a faceless banking institution. They were given 30 days to vacate the premises. The tragedy of their situation was magnified by the sheer, avoidable nature of it. They had traded their entire life savings, their secure retirement, and their social standing for a cheap illusion spun by a man wearing a faux velvet blazer. They packed their remaining belongings into brown cardboard boxes, downsizing from a sprawling estate to a cramped, generic rental apartment on the outskirts of the city. Their wealth evaporated, their status shattered, leaving them with nothing but the bitter reality of their own choices. While my parents packed away the ruins of their life, I sat in the climate-controlled legal department of my studio, fortifying my empire. I met with Jonathan Reed, my senior corporate counsel, spreading a thick stack of proactive insulation documents across his desk. We needed to ensure that as David and Joanne entered the chaotic, messy process of personal bankruptcy, they could not attempt to attach themselves to my logistical holding company as financial dependents. We established strict corporate firewalls, drafting impenetrable affidavits that legally severed any presumed financial ties between my personal assets and their mounting debts. I signed the paperwork with a steady hand, securing the perimeter. My company was a fortress, untouchable by the people who had spent my entire childhood trying to keep me small. Freed from the exhausting, suffocating emotional drain of their toxic orbit, my professional capacity expanded exponentially. I no longer spent my mental energy anticipating their next manipulative demand or dissecting their passive-aggressive insults. I channeled every ounce of my focus into the intricate, high-stakes world of global supply chain management. And the universe rewarded that singular focus. A prominent international streaming network announced plans to shoot a sweeping, blockbuster science fiction series in the heart of Georgia. The production required an unprecedented logistical infrastructure. They needed a firm capable of routing sensitive camera equipment from overseas, securing permits for sprawling marshland locations, and managing the daily operational freight for a crew of 500 people. My studio put forward a bid, and I was selected to lead the pitch. I walked into the executive boardroom overlooking the Atlanta skyline, armed with data, precision, and an unshakable confidence forged in the fires of a brutal family reckoning. The streaming executives threw complex, logistical nightmares at me, testing my capacity to handle crisis management. I dismantled every concern with cool, surgical logic, drawing on the same analytical detachment I used to expose Carter's fraudulent portfolio. The presentation was flawless. The streaming network executives recognized the ironclad competence radiating from my proposal. They signed the contract the very next morning. It was an exclusive, multi-year agreement valued in the high 8 figures. The deal cemented my logistics firm as the premier supply chain authority in the Southern entertainment sector. I earned a staggering promotion, a substantial equity stake in the studio, and a level of financial independence that most people only dream of achieving. I had built an empire from the ground up, utilizing the practical blue-collar work ethic my father had once mocked. I constructed a life of undeniable substance, surrounded by colleagues who valued my intellect, mentors who respected my drive, and a chosen family who celebrated my victories without demanding a hidden toll. As the autumn leaves began to turn, painting the Georgia landscape in vibrant shades of amber and gold, a profound, enduring peace settled over my daily routine. The frantic, anxious girl who sat in the stadium folding chair waiting for a round of applause was entirely gone. I did not need an audience to validate my worth anymore. I knew exactly who I was, and I knew the immense power of walking away. But the universe possesses a distinct, poetic sense of timing. 6 months after the country club disaster, the narrative required one final, quiet closing of the loop, bringing the past and the present together in a high-end dining room to prove exactly how far the scales had tipped. The warm glow of tiered crystal chandeliers cast fractured golden light across the pristine white linen of our dining table. The restaurant, an exclusive high-end establishment nestled in the heart of Atlanta's Buckhead district, buzzed with the quiet, confident hum of genuine success. The air carried the rich, earthy scent of black truffles, seared scallops, and vintage champagne. It was a Tuesday evening, exactly 6 months since the legal eviction at the Savannah Country Club, and my reality had transformed into something unrecognizable to the girl who once sat in that stadium folding chair. I sat at the head of a private alcove table, flanked by the senior members of my logistics team. Sarah, my lead international freight coordinator, held a crystal flute delicately between her fingers, her face flushed with genuine joy. Vincent Gaines, the studio vice president who had witnessed Carter's failed corporate ambush, sat to my right, offering a rare, relaxed smile. We were not gathered to celebrate a manufactured illusion or a fraudulent social climb. We were celebrating the official, ink-dried execution of the multi-year streaming network contract. The ink was barely dry on the paperwork that secured our firm as the premier supply chain authority in the Southern entertainment sector. Vincent raised his glass, drawing the attention of our small, formidable group. He did not boast about leveraging equity or demand arbitrary obedience. He looked at me with the quiet, earned respect shared between equals. "To hope," Vincent said, his voice steady and sincere. "You navigated a logistical minefield, protected this studio from severe liabilities, and delivered a pitch that redefined our operational capacity. You built this victory from the ground up. Cheers to the new empire." The crystal flutes met in the center of the table with a bright, resonant chime. I took a sip of the chilled champagne. The crisp, dry flavor grounded me in the present moment. I looked around at the faces of my colleagues, my chosen family, and felt a profound, unshakable security anchor itself in my chest. I did not have to shrink my ambitions to make them comfortable. I did not have to purchase their loyalty. They valued my intellect, my pragmatism, and my relentless drive. As the waiter cleared our appetizer plates, I let my gaze drift out toward the main dining room. The space was a masterclass in understated elegance, filled with industry leaders, corporate executives, and people who dealt in undeniable facts. My eyes tracked toward the front entrance, observing the steady flow of patrons navigating the host stand. The restaurant employed a small army of hospitality staff to manage the exclusive reservation list. A hostess emerged from the coat check room, carrying a heavy stack of leather-bound menus against her chest. She wore the standard restaurant uniform, a stiff black polyester dress that lacked any tailoring. Her hair, usually spun into elaborate, flawless curls, was pulled back into a severe utilitarian knot at the nape of her neck. As she turned to guide a party of 4 toward the dining floor, the chandelier light caught her profile. The breath stalled in my lungs. It was Melody, the golden child, the fragile artist groomed for a life of unearned luxury and European conservatory tours, was navigating the crowded floor of a restaurant she could no longer afford to dine in. I watched her walk. The effortless, gliding posture she used to command attention was entirely gone. Her shoulders slumped under the invisible, crushing weight of her new reality. Her steps were heavy, driven by the exhausting necessity of earning an hourly wage. As she passed a nearby table, I noticed a faint yellowish stain near the hem of her stiff polyester uniform, a stark contrast to the custom silk gowns she once demanded. The grapevine of extended relatives had provided brief, unsolicited updates over the past 6 months, filtering through my blocked caller logs and occasional intercepted emails. The criminal investigation into the forged venue contract had stripped away every layer of Melody's pristine image. While Carter remained a fugitive, dodging felony warrants across state lines, the local detectives had dragged Melody through a grueling accessory probe. To avoid formal indictment, she was forced to liquidate every asset she possessed to pay exorbitant legal retainer fees. The financial devastation did not stop with her. David and Joanne lost their sprawling suburban fortress to foreclosure. Their wealth evaporated, their social standing shattered into irreparable fragments. The affluent neighbors who once attended their lavish gatherings severed all contact, treating their family name like a contagious disease. My parents now resided in a cramped, 2-bedroom apartment near a noisy industrial highway. David, the fierce patriarch who obsessed over his superior status, spent his days sitting in a generic recliner, drowning in the bitter reality of his ruined credit. Joanne, stripped of her country club memberships and high society gossip circles, rarely left the confines of their small rental. Melody, unable to secure any position in the arts due to the highly publicized scandal, was forced into the service industry just to help her parents keep the electricity on. The pampered prodigy was now fetching water and wiping down tables to pay off the staggering debt left behind by the con artist she chose over her own blood. Melody set the leather menus down on a corner booth, forcing a tight, unnatural customer service smile onto her face as she addressed the patrons. The performance looked agonizing. As she turned to walk back toward the host stand, her gaze swept across the room and collided directly with mine. The physical reaction was instantaneous. Melody froze in the center of the walkway. The forced smile vanished, replaced by a sudden, hollow look of sheer panic. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin an ashen, sickly gray. She stood paralyzed, clutching a single reserve menu to her chest like a flimsy shield. She looked at my tailored designer suit. She looked at the senior executives laughing and sharing wine at my table. She looked at the undeniable, towering success I had built without a single ounce of their support. For a fraction of a second, the old family dynamic flickered in the air between us. The ghost of the arrogant, entitled sister tried to surface, searching for a way to twist this encounter into a weapon. But the reality of her stained uniform and my corporate stronghold crushed that ghost into dust. A dark, agonizing flush of shame crept up her neck, coloring her face in a vibrant display of ultimate defeat. She broke eye contact, dropping her gaze to the polished hardwood floor. She turned her body, shrinking her posture, and scurried quickly toward the kitchen doors, disappearing behind the frosted glass to hide from the staggering truth of our reversed roles. I sat in the glow of the chandelier, waiting for the familiar surge of vindication. I expected to feel a triumphant thrill, a desire to mock her, to revel in the poetic justice of her spectacular fall from grace. But the thrill never came. I looked at the frosted glass doors swinging gently on their hinges, and I felt nothing but a quiet, resolute peace. The anger that had fueled my drive for 22 years was gone. The opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference. I did not need to gloat over her ruined life, because her reality was a punishment far more severe than any insult I could deliver. The waiter arrived at our table, placing a sleek leather folio holding the final bill near my right hand. Vincent reached for his wallet, but I placed my hand flat over the folio, offering a firm, polite shake of my head. "This celebration is mine," I told him, matching his earlier sincerity. I opened my clutch and retrieved my corporate card, paying for the extravagant meal without a second thought. As the waiter returned the receipt, I reached into the zippered compartment of my purse. My fingers brushed against the crisp paper currency I kept for emergencies. I pulled out a single, pristine $100 bill. I set the cash down on the white linen tablecloth, smoothing the edges flat against the fabric. It was an echoing homage to the $50 bill I left at the steakhouse a year ago. That first bill marked the death of my silence. This $100 bill marked the final, irrefutable proof of my independence. I stood up, thanking my team for their exceptional work, and gathered my belongings. I walked across the restaurant floor, my heels clicking a steady, unbothered rhythm against the hard wood. I passed the host stand. I did not look for Melody. I did not cast a final glance toward the kitchen doors. The past held no currency in my present. I pushed the heavy glass doors open, stepping out into the crisp, cool Atlanta night. The city skyline glittered against the dark horizon, a sprawling network of lights, logistics, and limitless potential. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the fresh air, unburdened by the weight of toxic obligations and manufactured guilt. If you have made it to the end of this story, I want to leave you with one final, essential truth. We are conditioned to believe that family is an unbreakable contract, that blood demands endless sacrifice, and that walking away is a failure of character. But when the people who are supposed to protect you choose to exploit you instead, loyalty becomes a weapon used for your own destruction. Setting a boundary is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of survival. You do not owe your success to people who abandoned you in the shadows. You do not have to shrink your ambitions to make room for their delusions. Sometimes, the bravest, most profound thing you can do is simply stop holding up the mirrors for them. Let the illusion fall. Let them face the reality of their own choices. Your worth is not defined by those who refuse to see it. It is defined by the empire you build after you finally walk away. There is a distinct, almost cinematic mythology surrounding the traditional American family. We are sold a pervasive cultural vision of white picket fences, holiday dinners bathed in golden light, and unwavering, unconditional support. But beneath the polished veneer of suburban perfection, a silent, suffocating crisis often brews in the living rooms of homes that prioritize optics over honesty. The story we just witnessed, a tale of forged corporate signatures, shattered high society illusions, and a daughter who finally walked away, is not merely a dramatic thriller about supply chain logistics and a con artist. At its deepest, most resonant core, it is a profound cautionary tale about the devastating consequences of toxic parenting, the true meaning of family responsibility, and the generational cost of denying our children the one thing they need most: reality. In modern American culture, we frequently conflate providing for our children with indulging their delusions. David and Joanne, the architects of their own spectacular ruin, represent a brand of parenting that is tragically common. They believed that funding Melody's conservatory fantasies and shielding her from the harsh, practical realities of the working world demonstrated profound love. But true parenting is not a performance piece. It is not about grooming a golden child to serve as a decorative trophy for your own social ambitions. When parents prioritize a child's artistic or social aesthetic over their moral and emotional development, they are not raising a capable, independent adult. They are cultivating a parasite. Long-term guidance requires the courage to say no. It requires instilling a sense of fairness, ensuring that every child in the home understands the immutable laws of cause and effect. Melody was not born a monster. She was meticulously crafted into one by parents who abandoned their responsibility to teach her accountability. Equally tragic is the heavy burden placed on the invisible child. Emotional awareness in raising children means recognizing and celebrating them for who they intrinsically are, not what they can do for the parental ego. For 22 years, Hope was treated as an exploitable utility. Her logistical brilliance, her fierce independence, and her quiet, unyielding strength were dismissed as blue-collar simply because they did not sparkle under the crystal light of a country club chandelier. This gross inequity in a traditional family structure breeds a silent, dangerous resentment. When parents fail to distribute their love, attention, and validation fairly, they teach their children a highly destructive lesson, that love is purely transactional. They teach the favored child that they are completely above the rules, and they teach the forgotten child that they must perpetually earn their fundamental right to exist. Honesty is the absolute bedrock of family responsibility. David and Joanne built their sprawling suburban home on a fragile foundation of lies, lying to their affluent neighbors about their wealth, lying to themselves about Melody's actual talent, and ultimately, lying about the very nature of their love. They were willing to mortgage their future to fund a lie. When a family operates entirely on deception and the desperate pursuit of status, a catastrophic reckoning is not a possibility, it is an inevitability. The collapse of their empire was not caused by Hope's corporate injunction or Carter's felony forgery. It was caused by decades of refusing to live in the truth. If we genuinely want our children to grow into resilient, empathetic adults, we must model honesty, even when it is incredibly uncomfortable. We must teach them that true status is not bought with a second mortgage, but earned through unwavering integrity and hard work. Stories like this resonate so deeply because they hold up a harsh, unforgiving mirror to the quiet battles so many of us fight behind closed doors. If you found a piece of your own journey reflected in this narrative, if you understand the heavy, suffocating weight of breaking free from a family system designed to keep you small, I invite you to subscribe and follow Grape Echo Stories. We share these poignant, transformative journeys because there is immense power in knowing you are not alone in your reckoning, and that finding your voice is always worth the fight. Yet to truly extract the wisdom from this tragedy, we must be willing to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth. We are conditioned by society to revere the concept of unconditional family loyalty. Traditional values often dictate that blood is a binding, sacred contract, demanding endless forgiveness, infinite second chances, and the perpetual sacrifice of one's own mental peace for the sake of keeping the family together. We are taught that abandoning our family is the ultimate moral failure. But this is a dangerous, toxic fallacy. The story of Hope Barnes reveals a striking philosophical truth that goes violently against conventional thinking. Unconditional love does not equate to unconditional access. Sometimes, the greatest act of family responsibility is not holding the broken pieces together, but allowing the fragile, toxic illusion to finally shatter on the marble floor. True love, both for oneself and for one's family, sometimes requires the enforcement of impenetrable boundaries. We are conditioned to believe that we must set ourselves on fire to keep our parents warm. But what if the highest form of self-respect, and indeed the most profound lesson you can teach a dysfunctional family, is the willingness to let them experience the cold consequences of their own actions? By walking away, Hope did not betray her family. She stopped participating in their mutual destruction. Take a moment to look at your own dining table. Look at the invisible roles assigned to the people sitting around it. Who is being quietly asked to shrink so that someone else can shine? Who is carrying the weight of the family's reality while others dance in the delusion? The truth is, the most dangerous lies we tell are not the ones we project to the world, but the ones we tell ourselves about the people we share our blood with. In the end, blood only makes you related. It is your boundaries that make you free. And when the chandelier lights finally dim and the music inevitably stops, you must look into the silence and ask yourself a terrifying question. Are you living a life built on a comfortable illusion, or are you brave enough to leave a $50 bill on the table and walk out into the truth?